Hi everybody, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Danielle Staples and I'm going to conduct your annual review of the best practices in admissions. I've also invited all the financial aid personnel today because most of the policies are identical between admissions and financial aid procedures. First thing I want to cover with you is just the basic legal requirements of admissions or the student rights in general. There's three main constraints that must be considered when admitting a student. The first constraint is that the selection process may not be arbitrary or capricious. So what this means is the institution has to have a valid, documented reason why they are or are not accepting a student. This can't be based on opinion, your feelings, your change in mood. It has to be a policy or procedure that we've established that the student either has or has not fulfilled. And then it is important to document these items in case there is any legal action that comes down the road, especially when a student is not admitted to our college. The second constraint is that the college is bound by contract theory. We need to publish our standards and we need to honor our admissions decisions. So, for example, if we accept Bob on Monday and Sally comes on Tuesday, has a higher grade point average, has more potential to be successful, but we don't have room for her because we already accepted Bob, the decision's final. Bob is in. We cannot reverse our decision. We need to honor what we have offered to the student. The third constraint is that college policies may not discriminate. Now, discrimination is very broad. It can apply to race, sex, disability, age, residence, citizenship. It can be endless. Today, we're going to focus mainly on race and gender, but keep in mind there are policies on many different forms of discrimination. So the first policy that we're going to talk about is Title VI. Title VI is actually part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. This is going to apply to any program that receives federal financial assistance. So that could also be a private institution, even though we are public. If a private institution gives students federal financial aid or makes that available to them, they would also need to follow Title VI. Title IX is another legislative act that is part of the United States Education Amendments of 1972. So this actually came after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act focused on discrimination of race. Title IX focuses on prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex. And again, this applies to any program receiving federal financial assistance. So this came about specifically after the women's rights movements and the women's suffrage. What's interesting is that most people know Title IX for its impact on college athletics, but in our case, we're going to focus on its impact on admissions and financial aid. So the reason we have a concern is because we have seen much evidence that there is direct benefits to diversifying our student body. One of the benefits that we see is an increase of self-awareness for students. Students arrive on a college campus and they have their personalities and their perspectives already fully formed, or so they think. And this sense of self-knowledge can only be sharpened by exposing students to others whose life experiences are on the opposite spectrum. When we engage these students with others' opinions and customs and personal lifestyles that differ from their own, it really increases the students' self-insight. Another direct advantage of diversifying our student body is the increase in perspectives that come into the door. So it's not just the course curriculum that's the only source of knowledge in this college. The learning environment can be more robust if we add new material in the form of fresh viewpoints, providing students opportunities to learn from others, increases their capacity for exploring ideas and solutions on others' perspectives or vantage points. So, what this does is it facilitates creativity and it really enhances problem solving abilities. Additionally, we're creating professionals. And this world is a diverse world. And a diverse college experience encourages students to think about their careers on a global perspective and prepares them for the workforce that they are going to enter. And then the last and probably the most important benefit of diversity is civic engagement. We are providing opportunities for individuals from underrepresented populations to become future leaders. And this is something that needs to happen more. And this is why our institution has a diversifying policy. So one thing that comes up whenever we talk about increasing diversity is the topic of affirmative action. So what is affirmative action? Affirmative action is designed to increase the number of persons from underrepresented groups. So this can be racial groups, it could be genders, it could be any type of underrepresented population. I'm going to focus on race relations for right now, but keep in mind that these topics can also apply to gender and other types of underrepresented groups. Okay, there's three main types of affirmative action that you'll encounter. There is what's called race neutral, there is differential, and there is race conscious affirmative action. So I'd like to talk about each of those types and what they are and how an institution could implement those. So first, let's talk about the race neutral affirmative action. Race neutral means that it's uniform between students. So all students follow the same set of guidelines. So for example, if we notice that there are not as many African American or Latino students in our institution that we feel there should be, then we could essentially look for a policy change to try to affect that and try to encourage more diversity in our school. But if we're using a race neutral affirmative action, we don't apply the new policy to just the Black students or just the Latino students. The policy would apply to all students. So it's neutral. No matter what race or gender you are, you can experience the new policy. One thing I want to point out is when we talk about us wanting to increase diversity, it's okay for us to set ourselves goals and say, diversity increasing is something we want to do. It is never okay to establish a quota. So, for example, it would not be okay to say, next year we are going to enroll 10 students in our nursing program and they are all going to be African American students. Not acceptable. It would be okay to say, next year we would like to see 15% of the nursing population be African American. Setting a goal is always acceptable, but it's never okay to predetermine a number that you are going to enroll of a certain type of student. So how do you go about a race-neutral affirmative action without setting a quota? One way a school could approach this is possibly by changing marketing. Maybe they target specific regions when they market their school. They could visit diverse local area high schools and talk about programs that the college offers. But in general, that's a recruiting process. That's a marketing process. It's not specialized treatment of students. The next type of affirmative action is the differential or the compensatory affirmative action. This type of affirmative action looks at equal treatment as possibly being inequitable, meaning there may be some unfair barriers that could be in the policies. And because of that, we possibly want to treat students differently, or we want to offer some supplementary standards. And that's appropriate as long as we're doing it with the intent to avoid disadvantaging the student any further because of their race or gender. We do not do these types of policies to create a preference. Again, the whole goal of this is to avoid discrimination, not create discriminating a different group of people. Okay? So it is possible to modify standards, but we only want to do it to the extent necessary to counteract the discriminatory effects that are happening because of a uniform standard that has been used in the past. Now, it is also important for these supplementary standards or different standards. We only do this for students that are qualified to be admitted to our colleges. So these modifications are merely there to avoid disadvantaging a student. We do not create these modifications to have a race preference. And then again, I put it on here because it's very important. Quotas are never, ever permitted in affirmative action policies. The last type of affirmative action is probably the most dangerous of the three. And when I say dangerous, it is the option that can find you in court if it is not appropriately done. And this is the race-conscious affirmative action. So these race-conscious specifically focuses on a specific minority group. Individual colleges that tend to do race-conscious affirmative actions often do it because it's mandated on them. So, for example, if there's evidence that the institution discriminated in the past and the federal government catches wind of this, there may be mandatory affirmative action policies placed on the institution because the government feels this could be the only way to right the effects of the wrongs that the institution did in the past. Now, some institutions do voluntary race-conscious affirmative action, and it can be done as long as it is done appropriately. So when it's race conscious, you are giving an advantage to minority students only, which can cause some issues because it does appear that a preference has been created. So there is a danger of reverse discrimination, which there's been multiple lawsuits about that recently. What is important is if you are going to implement this type of race-conscious affirmative action, it is important that the candidates are still competitive for their position. They aren't simply handed a position because they're African American or Latino or Asian. They do need to be qualified. There does need to be a competitive nature, and they do need to earn their position in the college. They can't simply just be given the position based solely on race. Again, quotas are still not appropriate no matter what type of affirmative action you are using. So even if you are doing a race-conscious affirmative action, it's never okay to have a pre-established number of minority students that you are intending to enroll in the college or the program. Also, it is not appropriate to have a separate scoring system. So for instance, white students will use the Accuplacer exam to place into our new program, but a minority group of students gets a lower level Accuplacer exam to place into the same program. The scoring mechanism that's used needs to be consistent. There shouldn't be a separate whole set of criteria for a group of students. Also, before implementing a race-conscious affirmative action policy, it is mandated by the government that you have exhausted all race-neutral options prior to this race-conscious implementation. If you've not exhausted all of the race-neutral options, then you could be directly violating the United States Constitution. So for your information, I did include a snippet of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And I underlined the area that causes a lot of lawsuits in the United States today. So the area that seems to cause the most issues is the area of due process and equal protection. So the 14th Amendment does state that any state should not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So when preferential affirmative action treatments are set by colleges to undo the disadvantages that have been done over the years of discrimination, sometimes white students will often feel that they are not receiving the equal protection of the law. And many students have won on that background. I want you all to be clear of what the ACC non-discrimination policy is, because we get quite a bit more specific than any of the legislation that I presented to you today. So we do have a non-discrimination statement in our legal policies, and the most important part is what I've underlined for you. The college does not discriminate on the basis of sex, gender, race, color, age, creed, national or ethnic origin, physical or mental disability, veteran status, pregnancy status, religion, genetic information, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And just so you know, this does apply for our employment practices. It also applies for any educational programs and activities at ACC. So please, as you advise students in these next few months, keep this in mind. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to anyone else that can assist you. The last thing we want you to do is to make a decision that could impact someone's lives, and we are always willing to help guide you on those decisions when you're unsure. For further information on all of the policies that I've discussed today, and for where most of the information from this presentation came from, please review the following references. And if you have any questions, please let me know.